Have you ever wondered what happens when overconfidence meets the jungle at night? We often hear about the great battles of the Vietnam War, the strategic bombing campaigns, the political decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington and Hanoi. But we rarely talk about those small, terrifying encounters where a handful of men faced impossible odds in complete darkness. Today, I am going to share with you the true story of a reconnaissance patrol that was taunted, hunted, and nearly annihilated by North Vietnamese regulars, only to turn the tables in the most unexpected way. A story about tactical brilliance, psychological warfare, and how the jungle itself became both enemy and ally. Prepare to discover how 6 American soldiers survived a night that military analysts still study today as a textbook example of small unit tactics under extreme duress. If you are here, we share something profound. A fascination with the untold stories that reveal the true nature of modern warfare. Finding content that authentically explores the tactical, psychological, and human dimensions of the Vietnam conflict is not easy. This channel exists for that purpose. Every video represents extensive research into declassified after-action reports, veteran interviews, and tactical analyses. We tell these stories with the respect they deserve. Subscribe now and become part of our community. Together, we will honor those who faced the impossible and emerged changed forever. Now, back to March 1968.
March 17, 1968, 23:47 hours, grid coordinates YD 162847, 17 kilometers southwest of Hue City, Republic of Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Michael Delaney pressed his body into the wet earth beneath a stand of bamboo so dense the moonlight could not penetrate, and he listened. Not with his ears alone, but with every nerve ending in his body that had learned to read the jungle during his 11 months in country. The sound came again, closer now, a metallic clink that could only be a weapon sling swivel striking against a canteen or ammunition pouch. The 6-man reconnaissance team from 1st Force Reconnaissance Company had been compromised, and Delaney knew with absolute certainty that the North Vietnamese Army soldiers tracking them through the darkness were doing so deliberately, announcing their presence, playing with their prey like a cat that has cornered a mouse. His radio operator, Lance Corporal James Chen, lay 3 feet to his left, hand already on the handset of the PRC-25 radio, waiting for the signal to call in their situation. But Delaney hesitated because transmitting would give away their exact position, and right now their only advantage was that the NVA knew their general location, but not their precise coordinates. The temperature was 78 degrees Fahrenheit, the humidity 93%, and Delaney could feel sweat mixing with the camouflage paint on his face, creating rivulets that tickled as they traced paths down his jaw. He counted his team in his mind like a captain counting his crew, not with numbers, but with the weight of responsibility for each life. Chen with the radio, 22 years old from San Francisco, on his 2nd tour because he had extended. Corporal Robert Haskins, 24, from rural Alabama, the team's point man whose ability to read terrain was almost supernatural. Lance Corporal David Morrison, 19, from Philadelphia, the youngest member who had been in country only 4 months, but moved through the jungle like he had been born there. Corporal Timothy Walsh, 23, from Boston, the team medic who carried 42 pounds of medical supplies in addition to his combat load. And Private First Class Eduardo Martinez, 20 years old, from El Paso, the assistant radio operator who spoke fluent Spanish and passable Vietnamese, which had proven useful on 3 separate occasions when they had needed to question civilians. 6 men carrying a combined total of approximately 420 pounds of equipment, weapons, ammunition, water, and rations, now hunted by an enemy force that Delaney estimated at platoon strength, somewhere between 30 and 40 soldiers, based on the sounds moving through the jungle around their position. The mission had begun 68 hours earlier, when their CH-46 helicopter had inserted them into a landing zone cut into the jungle canopy by previous bombing runs. Their objective to conduct reconnaissance and surveillance of suspected North Vietnamese Army infiltration routes following the Tet Offensive that had shocked American forces and the South Vietnamese government 6 weeks prior. Intelligence reports suggested that the NVA was moving supplies and reinforcements through this area of operations, preparing for follow-up attacks, and higher command needed eyes on the ground to confirm or deny these reports. The insertion had been textbook perfect, the helicopter touching down for exactly 12 seconds, while the team jumped from the rear ramp and disappeared into the tree line before the aircraft lifted off, its rotor wash flattening the elephant grass and sending up clouds of red dust that hung in the air like a curtain. For the first 2 days, the patrol had moved carefully through their assigned area, observing, photographing, and documenting everything they saw. They had found evidence of recent enemy activity, trails that showed signs of heavy use, rest areas where the earth was compressed, and cigarette butts littered the ground. And on the second day, they had discovered a concealed cache containing approximately 200 pounds of rice, 37 mortar rounds, and medical supplies still in their original Chinese packaging. Delaney had radioed this information back to the Tactical Operations Center, and command had ordered them to continue their reconnaissance for another 24 hours before extraction. It was during their 3rd day in the jungle that things had started to go wrong in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The first indication had come at 14:30 hours when Haskins, walking point 25 meters ahead of the main body, had frozen with his fist raised in the halt signal. When Delaney moved forward to his position, the point man had indicated a tripwire stretched across the trail at ankle height, nearly invisible against the background of dead leaves and undergrowth. It was the type of booby trap the Viet Cong used, typically connected to a grenade or artillery shell rigged to detonate when the wire was disturbed. But what concerned Delaney was that the wire was brand new, the rust-free metal gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight, meaning it had been placed recently, possibly that morning, possibly after intelligence had observed their insertion and calculated their likely patrol route. Haskins carefully marked the trap with a small piece of pink surveyor tape tied to a branch at eye level, a warning for any friendly forces that might patrol this area later, and the team moved around the obstacle, deviating from their planned route for the first time. 3 hours later, they encountered a second tripwire, this one even more obvious than the first, almost as if whoever had placed it wanted it to be seen. Delaney felt the first cold touch of unease settle into his stomach, because booby traps were meant to be hidden, not advertised, unless their purpose was not to kill, but to channel movement, to herd the team in a specific direction, like hunters driving game toward waiting guns. He made the decision to alter their route again, this time moving perpendicular to their original line of advance, heading toward higher ground where the jungle thinned and visibility improved. They reached the high ground at 18:20 hours as the sun was beginning its rapid descent toward the western horizon, that brief period of twilight in the tropics that lasts perhaps 30 minutes before full darkness descends like a falling curtain. Delaney chose a position for their overnight defensive perimeter on a slight rise that offered good observation in 3 directions, with a nearly vertical cliff face protecting their rear. Each man took a position forming a rough circle, spacing themselves approximately 10 meters apart, close enough to support each other but far enough that a single grenade could not take out multiple team members. They ate cold rations, sea-ration meals that required no heating and produced no telltale cooking fires or smells. And as darkness fell, they settled into their rotation of watch duties, 2 men awake at all times, while the others tried to catch whatever sleep was possible in the jungle at night, where every sound could be a threat, and relaxation was a luxury no one could afford. It was at 2215 hours that they heard the first voices, Vietnamese voices speaking at normal conversational volume, making no attempt at noise discipline, the words carrying clearly through the night air. Chen, who had picked up some Vietnamese during his tours, translated in a whisper that made the hair on the back of Delaney's neck stand up. The voices were talking about Americans, about a recon team, about how they would be dead by morning. The words were clearly meant to be overheard, a form of psychological warfare designed to erode the team's morale, to make them panic, to cause them to either reveal their position by opening fire or attempt to evade and walk into an ambush. Delaney passed hand signals to his team, 2 fingers pointed at his own eyes, then a closed fist, the silent communication meaning stay alert, hold position, do not engage unless absolutely necessary. What the North Vietnamese soldiers did not know, could not have known because intelligence failures worked both ways, was that this particular reconnaissance team had survived situations that would have broken other units, and their sergeant had developed a reputation for tactical improvisation that bordered on the miraculous. The voices continued for approximately 45 minutes, sometimes close enough that Delaney could hear individual words, even without translation, sometimes fading into the distance, only to return from a different direction, a pattern that confirmed his suspicion that the enemy was trying to locate them, using sound as a form of sonar to triangulate their position based on any reaction. At 2330 hours, the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The normal jungle sounds of insects and night birds absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then came the metallic sounds, deliberate and repeated, weapons being loaded, magazines being inserted into rifles, bolts being pulled back and released with sharp snaps that echoed through the darkness. Delaney understood the tactic immediately because he had studied enemy doctrine during his training and refined that knowledge through hard experience. The NVA were attempting to provoke a response, betting that nervous soldiers would interpret the sounds as preparation for an immediate assault and open fire, revealing their positions and sacrificing the advantage of concealment. He remained motionless, breathing slowly through his nose, willing his heart rate to slow despite the adrenaline flooding his system, and he trusted that his team would follow his example because they had trained together, fought together, and survived together, creating the kind of unit cohesion that cannot be taught in any school, but only forged through shared danger. Have you ever caught yourself wondering what it must be like to sit in darkness, knowing you are being hunted, hearing the enemy announce their intentions, feeling the weight of responsibility for 5 other lives in your hands? Or perhaps you have a family member who served in Vietnam and never spoke about nights like these, about the fear and the tactics and the impossible decisions made in darkness. I know many of you carry connections to this war, questions that have never been fully answered, stories that deserve to be heard. This is your space to share them. Leave in the comments what you want to know about small unit tactics, jungle warfare, or the experiences of those who fought in Vietnam. Your questions might lead us to stories that need to be told. I am pausing here because these histories matter most when we engage with them personally, when we move beyond the statistics to understand the human reality of these moments. Now back to that terrifying night in March 1968. At 23:55 hours, the situation evolved in a way that Delaney had not anticipated, but that demonstrated why the North Vietnamese army was such a formidable opponent despite technological disadvantages compared to American forces. The voices returned, but this time they were speaking English, heavily accented but clearly understandable, calling out in mocking tones. They shouted that the Americans were surrounded, that resistance was futile, that if they surrendered now, they would be treated as prisoners of war in accordance with international conventions. The promises were lies, Delaney knew, because intelligence briefings had made clear that reconnaissance teams captured by the NVA in this area of operations rarely survived long enough to reach prisoner of war camps. The intelligence they carried in their heads being extracted through interrogation methods that violated every principle of the Geneva Conventions. But what struck him as he listened was not the content of the taunts, but their purpose, and he suddenly understood that the NVA commander was good, possibly very good, because he was not simply trying to locate the American team, but was actively working to break their psychological cohesion, to create doubt and fear that would cause mistakes, would cause someone to snap and do something foolish. The temperature had dropped to 74 degrees Fahrenheit, and Delaney could feel Martinez shaking beside him, not from cold, but from the strain of maintaining absolute silence while listening to threats delivered in his own language. He reached over slowly and placed his hand on the young Marine's shoulder, applying gentle pressure, a physical reminder that he was not alone, that his sergeant was there and had a plan, even if that plan was not yet apparent. The technical reality of their situation was stark and undeniable when analyzed objectively. The six-man team carried between them 3 M16A1 rifles, 2 M14 rifles that Haskins and Walsh preferred for their stopping power and longer effective range, and 1 M79 grenade launcher carried by Morrison, along with his sidearm. They had a combined ammunition load of approximately 1,200 rounds of small arms ammunition and 36 grenades for the M79, which sounds like a substantial amount until you consider that a sustained firefight can consume ammunition at a rate that would exhaust their supply in minutes. Their radio had a maximum effective range of approximately 5 kilometers for ground-to-ground communication in jungle terrain, though that range could be extended significantly when transmitting to aircraft. The nearest friendly forces were at Fire Support Base Birmingham, 18 kilometers to the northeast, too far for rapid reaction, but close enough that artillery support was theoretically available if they could survive long enough to call it in and adjust fire. The North Vietnamese forces hunting them were likely armed with a mix of AK-47 assault rifles, SKS carbines, and at least 1 or 2 RPD light machine guns, based on the sounds Delaney had catalogued in his mental database during his months in country. The standard NVA infantry platoon in 1968 consisted of approximately 30 to 40 men, organized into 3 squads, typically commanded by a lieutenant with a senior sergeant as second in command. Soldiers who had been fighting since their teenage years, first against the French, then against the Americans and South Vietnamese, their tactical proficiency earned through years of combat experience rather than training courses at expensive military academies. The terrain heavily favored the defenders if Delaney could transform his team from hunted to hunters, because the high ground they occupied offered excellent fields of fire in most directions. But it also meant they were essentially trapped with the cliff at their back and limited routes for withdrawal if the situation deteriorated beyond salvage. At 00:23 hours on March 18th, Delaney made his decision, and it was based not on doctrine or training, but on intuition developed through 11 months of surviving in an environment where mistakes were measured in body bags. He slowly extracted his map from its waterproof case and used a red lens flashlight to examine the terrain, shielding the faint glow with his body so it could not be seen more than a few feet away. The map showed what he had already observed during their approach, that approximately 150 meters to their south, downslope from their current position, was a stream bed that ran roughly east to west through a narrow valley. Stream beds in the Vietnamese highlands during the dry season were often dry or contained only shallow water, but they served as natural highways through the jungle, routes that offered easier movement than the surrounding terrain with its thick undergrowth and steep slopes. If the NVA were deploying to assault the American position, they would likely use that stream bed as an avenue of approach, moving into position under cover of darkness, then launching their attack at first light when they could see their targets and coordinate their fire. The standard doctrine for a reconnaissance team in this situation would be to call in their coordinates, request immediate extraction, and try to survive until helicopters could reach them. But helicopters were noisy. Visible targets that drew fire like magnets attracted iron, and the NVA would hear them coming from kilometers away, would have time to position heavy weapons, would shoot them down or drive them off before they could complete the extraction. Delaney knew this because he had seen it happen, had witnessed aircraft shot out of the sky, had watched helplessly as burning helicopters fell into the jungle, carrying crews and passengers to their deaths. He needed a different solution, something the enemy would not anticipate, and as he studied the map in the dim red glow of his flashlight, an idea began to form, audacious and dangerous but possibly workable if executed perfectly and if luck, that capricious element that no amount of planning could guarantee, was on their side. He moved to each team member in turn, using hand signals and whispered instructions to communicate his plan, watching their faces in the darkness to gauge their reactions, looking for doubt or hesitation that might indicate a lack of confidence in what he was proposing. What he saw instead was understanding and grim determination, because every man on this team knew that survival in Vietnam often meant doing things that made no sense according to conventional military wisdom, meant taking calculated risks that balanced the certainty of death against the possibility of living to see another sunrise. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution, and it required the team to do something that violated every instinct of self-preservation, something that would seem like madness to anyone who had not learned to think like their enemy. They were going to abandon the high ground, were going to leave their defensible position with its good fields of fire and protective cliff face, and they were going to move downhill in complete darkness toward the very stream bed where the NVA were likely assembling, were going to deliberately insert themselves behind the enemy force, turning the hunters into the hunted through a tactical maneuver that depended entirely on stealth, timing, and the assumption that the North Vietnamese commander would never expect his quarry to move toward danger rather than away from it. Haskins, the point man, looked at Delaney with an expression that in the faint starlight might have been respect, or might have been the kind of fatalistic humor that combat veterans develop as a coping mechanism, and he gave a single nod of acknowledgement before beginning to prepare his gear for movement, checking that nothing would rattle or make noise, that every item was secured, that he was ready to lead them into the darkness on a mission that could end in their annihilation or their salvation, depending on factors they could influence but not entirely control. At 045 hours they began their movement, each man placing his feet with the exaggerated care of someone defusing a bomb, testing the ground before committing his weight, avoiding dry branches that would snap, choosing paths through the undergrowth that offered the least resistance, moving at a pace that seemed agonizingly slow, but was dictated by the absolute necessity of maintaining silence. Haskins led, followed at 5-meter intervals by Morrison, then Walsh, then Martinez and Chen, with Delaney bringing up the rear where he could observe the entire team and make decisions based on changing circumstances. The descent from their position to the stream bed covered a horizontal distance of approximately 150 meters, but a vertical drop of nearly 40 meters, steep enough that they had to use vines and tree roots to control their descent in some places, navigating by starlight and the faint ambient glow that penetrated the jungle canopy, their night vision adapting slowly but never completely to the darkness that seemed almost solid in its intensity. Twice they froze as voices drifted through the jungle from upslope, North Vietnamese soldiers apparently still searching the area where the American team had been positioned, their frustration evident in the tone, even though Delaney could not understand the words. Each time they remained motionless for several minutes, barely breathing, until the voices faded and they could continue their careful descent. The movement took nearly 40 minutes to cover that short distance. 40 minutes during which Delaney's leg muscles burned from the constant tension of controlled movement, during which every sound seemed amplified to the point where he was certain they must have been heard, during which he questioned his decision a dozen times, but kept moving because turning back was not an option, and standing still meant death just as surely as moving forward might. They reached the stream bed at 01:27 hours and found exactly what Delaney had anticipated based on his reading of the terrain and his understanding of enemy tactics. The stream bed was indeed dry except for scattered pools of stagnant water, and more importantly, it showed fresh signs of recent traffic, footprints in the sandy soil, disturbed vegetation where soldiers had moved through, and most telling, the lingering smell of cigarette smoke that indicated the NVA had staged here recently, perhaps within the last hour, before moving upslope toward where they expected to find the American team. Delaney positioned his men in 2 teams of 3, spacing them approximately 40 meters apart along the stream bed, choosing positions that offered concealment in the vegetation that overhung the banks while providing clear fields of fire along the natural corridor. The tactical mathematics of what he was attempting were brutal in their simplicity. If the NVA discovered them before the trap could be sprung, the American team would be caught in the open, in an indefensible position, outnumbered by a ratio of at least 6 to 1, and they would die quickly. But if the enemy did not discover them, if they continued to search upslope and eventually concluded that the Americans had somehow evaded them, they would return along this same stream bed because it was the most efficient route back to wherever their base camp was located, and they would walk directly into an ambush where the Americans would have the advantage of surprise, preparation, and tactical positioning despite being vastly outnumbered. The wait was measured not in minutes but in heartbeats, in the slow passage of time that occurs when every second is filled with the possibility of discovery and death. Delaney could hear his own pulse in his ears, could feel the weight of his rifle in his hands, could taste the fear that was not absence of courage, but acknowledgement of reality, the understanding that what they were attempting required not just skill, but luck, and luck was a fickle companion in combat. At 0213 hours, they heard movement upslope, voices raised in what sounded like argument, the North Vietnamese commander apparently frustrated by his inability to locate the American team, perhaps questioning his own intelligence, perhaps wondering if they had somehow extracted during the night, though he would have heard helicopters if that had occurred. The voices gradually faded, moving away to the west, parallel to the stream bed, and Delaney allowed himself a small measure of hope that his gamble might actually work. At 0255 hours, the first sounds of returning movement reached their positions, boots scraping on rock, the rustle of equipment, voices speaking in low tones that suggested soldiers who were tired, frustrated, and no longer at their peak alertness because they had spent hours searching for an enemy who seemed to have vanished. Delaney raised his rifle slowly, sighting along the barrel at the darkness, waiting, listening as the sounds grew closer, counting seconds, calculating distances, preparing to initiate the ambush at the optimal moment when the maximum number of enemy soldiers would be in the kill zone, when surprise would be total, when the shock effect would be greatest. The first North Vietnamese soldier appeared at 0302 hours, a silhouette darker than the surrounding darkness, moving along the streambed with the confident stride of someone who believed themselves to be in friendly territory, who had relaxed their guard because the hunt had been unsuccessful and they were heading home. Behind him came others, strung out along the streambed in a loose column formation that was tactically unsound, but reflected their fatigue and frustration. Delaney waited, counting, letting them enter the kill zone, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his M14, breathing slowly and evenly, despite the adrenaline that made his hands want to shake. He could see perhaps a dozen soldiers in the limited visibility, knew there would be more behind them, calculated that he needed to let the column continue entering the ambush until the maximum number were vulnerable. At 15 soldiers visible, he made his decision, knew he could not wait longer without risking that the tail of the column would escape, and he initiated the ambush by firing a single shot that sounded like thunder in the narrow confines of the streambed. That first shot was a signal rather than an attempt to kill, a trigger that unleashed controlled violence from 6 positions simultaneously as the reconnaissance team opened fire with a discipline born of training and experience. The M79 grenade launcher thumped twice in rapid succession, Morrison sending high explosive rounds into the center and rear of the enemy column, the detonations lighting up the night and turning the streambed into a nightmare of concussion and fragmentation. The rifles barked in short, controlled bursts, 3 round groups aimed at the silhouettes that were now diving for cover, returning fire wildly, shouting in confusion and fear. The engagement lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, according to Delaney's later after-action report, though to the participants it seemed both instantaneous and eternal, time distorting under the influence of adrenaline and mortal fear. The reconnaissance team fired with economy, selecting targets, conserving ammunition, using the terrain to their advantage while denying it to the enemy. The North Vietnamese soldiers, caught in the open, unable to determine exactly where the fire was coming from, operating in darkness that concealed friend from foe, took casualties that Delaney could not count, but could infer from the screams and the sudden silences that followed muzzle flashes. At 0306 hours, he gave the signal to cease fire, and the night went silent, except for the ringing in their ears and the moans of wounded men scattered along the streambed. He did not pause to assess casualties or collect weapons or perform any of the tasks that doctrine suggested should follow a successful ambush, because staying in place would allow the enemy to reorganize, to determine what had happened, to respond with potentially overwhelming force. Instead, he led his team away from the kill zone at the fastest pace they could sustain while maintaining security, moving downstream, using the streambed themselves now as an avenue of escape, covering nearly 3 kilometers before the sky began to lighten in the east with the first hints of approaching dawn. At 0523 hours, with sufficient light to see clearly, Delaney called a halt and finally allowed Chen to transmit their situation report to the Tactical Operations Center. The radio operator's voice was steady, despite exhaustion, as he spoke the codes and coordinates that would bring helicopters for extraction, that would alert higher command that the reconnaissance team was still alive, still operational, having survived a night that by all reasonable calculation should have ended in their deaths or capture. The response from the Tactical Operations Center was immediate. Helicopters would be airborne within 15 minutes. Estimated time of arrival at the extraction point was 43 minutes. Air support was being scrambled to provide cover during the extraction. Delaney selected a landing zone in a small clearing approximately 800 meters from their current position, an area large enough for one helicopter, defensible if they had to wait, and unlikely to be under direct observation by any enemy forces in the area. They reached the landing zone at 0547 hours and established a defensive perimeter while they waited, each man finding what cover was available, facing outward, weapons ready, knowing that until they were actually aboard the helicopter and climbing out of range of ground fire, they remained vulnerable. The wait seemed interminable, though it was less than 20 minutes before they heard the distinctive sound of rotor blades chopping through the morning air. A UH-1 Huey helicopter, flanked by two AH-1 Cobra gunships that circled the area like predators looking for targets. The extraction was executed flawlessly, the helicopter touching down for less than 30 seconds while the team scrambled aboard, then lifting off in a steep climb that pressed them into their seats as the pilot applied maximum power to get above small arms range as quickly as possible. As they flew back toward their base, Delaney looked at his team, at the faces that showed exhaustion and relief, and the kind of satisfaction that comes from having faced death and survived through skill and courage and luck that could not be relied upon, but had been there when needed. Chen sat with his radio between his knees, no longer alert and tense, but relaxed in the way soldiers relax after combat, when the adrenaline fades and the body demands rest. Haskins stared out the open door at the jungle passing below, perhaps thinking about the movement through darkness, about the footsteps that had needed to be perfect, because a single mistake would have doomed them all. Morrison cradled his grenade launcher like a sleeping child, the weapon that had been decisive in the ambush, that had broken the enemy formation and created the chaos that allowed the team to achieve success despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Walsh checked his medical supplies, inventorying what he had used and what remained, preparing for the next mission, because there was always a next mission in Vietnam, always another patrol, always another night in the jungle. Martinez sat with his eyes closed, perhaps praying, perhaps simply grateful to be alive. The helicopter crew chief, a corporal who had seen dozens of extractions, looked at the team with the expression of someone who recognized combat veterans when he saw them, soldiers who had gone out and done their job and come back alive when that outcome was never guaranteed. The after-action debriefing at 1st Force Reconnaissance Company headquarters lasted 3 hours, as intelligence officers questioned Delaney and his team about every detail of their patrol, about the enemy forces they had encountered, about the equipment and tactics observed, about the effectiveness of the ambush and the estimated enemy casualties. The initial assessment suggested that the reconnaissance team had killed or wounded between 8 and 14 North Vietnamese soldiers based on the volume and accuracy of fire, though actual numbers were impossible to confirm without returning to the ambush site, which was not tactically feasible. More important than the body count, which was the metric that higher command obsessed over, but which meant little in the larger context of the war, was the intelligence gathered during the patrol, the confirmation that NVA forces were indeed using the area for infiltration, that they were operating in platoon strength formations, that they were well equipped and professionally led. The photographs taken by the team during their reconnaissance, the coordinates of the supply cache, the observations about enemy movements and tactics, all of this information was compiled and forwarded up the chain of command, where it would be analyzed by staff officers and used to plan future operations. For Delaney and his team, the mission was simply another entry in their records, another patrol completed, another night survived, adding to the accumulated experience that separated living veterans from names on memorial walls. The tactical analysis of the engagement reveals several key factors that contributed to the American team's survival and success, despite being vastly outnumbered and operating deep in enemy-controlled territory. First was Delaney's recognition that the North Vietnamese forces were not simply hunting his team, but were attempting to manipulate them through psychological pressure, that the taunts and the deliberate noise were designed to provoke a response rather than being indicators of an immediate assault. By refusing to react, by maintaining noise discipline and positional security, he denied the enemy the information they needed to locate his team precisely. Second was his understanding of terrain and enemy tactics. His ability to predict that the stream bed would serve as both an assembly area and a route of withdrawal for the NVA forces, which allowed him to position his team in a location where they could achieve surprise despite the enemy's numerical advantage. Third was the discipline and cohesion of the reconnaissance team itself. Soldiers who trusted their sergeant's judgment enough to follow him into a maneuver that seemed counterintuitive but proved tactically sound. Fourth was the effective use of available firepower, particularly the M79 grenade launcher, which provided area effect weapons against clustered enemy forces and compensated for the Americans' lack of automatic weapons and numerical superiority. Fifth was the decision to break contact immediately after the ambush rather than attempting to exploit success, recognizing that the tactical situation would shift dramatically once the enemy recovered from their surprise and organized a response. These factors, combined with training, experience, and what soldiers call luck, but what might better be described as the intersection of preparation and opportunity, transformed what should have been a disaster into a tactical victory that had value far beyond the immediate engagement. The broader context of this engagement places it within the larger framework of the Vietnam War in early 1968, a period of tremendous uncertainty and confusion for American forces following the Tet Offensive that had begun on January 30th and shattered many assumptions about the war's progress. Although American and South Vietnamese forces had defeated the attacks in military terms, inflicting catastrophic casualties on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units that had attempted to seize cities throughout South Vietnam, the political and psychological impact of the offensive had been profound. The American public, which had been told repeatedly that victory was within reach, that enemy forces were on the verge of collapse, suddenly saw images of fighting in the streets of Saigon, of enemy commandos attacking the American embassy, of battles raging in cities that were supposed to be secure. The disconnect between official optimism and visible reality created a crisis of confidence that would ultimately contribute to the decision to begin withdrawing American forces from Vietnam. Within this larger strategic picture, the actions of small reconnaissance teams like Delaney's represented the tactical level of war, the place where strategic decisions and political considerations meant nothing compared to the immediate realities of survival and mission accomplishment. These teams operated in the spaces between major units, gathering intelligence, disrupting enemy movements, and surviving through a combination of skill and determination that remained constant regardless of how the larger war was progressing. The legacy of operations like the March 17 patrol extends beyond the immediate tactical results to influence military doctrine and training in ways that are still evident decades later. The small unit tactics employed by reconnaissance teams in Vietnam, the emphasis on stealth and surprise, the ability to operate independently deep in enemy territory, the integration of tactical air support and helicopter mobility, all of these elements became fundamental components of special operations doctrine that continues to evolve in current conflicts. The lessons learned about psychological operations, about how enemy forces will attempt to manipulate and intimidate isolated units, about the importance of mental resilience and unit cohesion under extreme stress. These insights were incorporated into training programs for subsequent generations of soldiers. The technical innovations developed or refined during the Vietnam War, improvements in radio communications, night vision technology, helicopter aviation tactics, close air support procedures, many of these were direct responses to challenges faced by units like Delaney's team. Perhaps most significantly, the experience of Vietnam forced American military leadership to confront the reality that technological superiority and numerical advantage do not automatically translate into tactical or strategic success, that wars are ultimately fought and won or lost by individual soldiers and small units whose effectiveness depends not just on equipment, but on training, leadership, morale, and the ability to adapt to circumstances that cannot be predicted or controlled from headquarters thousands of miles away. For the 6 men who lived through that night in March 1968, the experience remained a defining moment in their lives, though each processed it differently according to his own personality and subsequent experiences. Delaney completed his tour in Vietnam and returned to the United States in July 1968, eventually leaving the Marine Corps after 12 years of service with the rank of Master Sergeant, carrying with him the accumulated weight of missions and decisions that only other combat veterans could fully understand. Chen extended again and served a 3rd tour before finally going home, finding that civilian life felt strange and disconnected after years in a combat zone, struggling like so many veterans to reconcile the person he had become in Vietnam with the person his family and friends expected him to be. Haskins returned to Alabama and largely withdrew from society, living alone in the woods, finding peace in solitude because the crowded, noisy civilian world felt overwhelming and incomprehensible after the jungle, where every sound carried meaning and survival depended on constant vigilance. Morrison, the youngest, seemed to adjust more easily, using the GI Bill to attend college, eventually becoming a teacher, though he never spoke about Vietnam except to other veterans who would understand without judgment what could not be easily explained. Walsh worked as a paramedic for 30 years, his combat medical training translating directly into civilian emergency medicine, finding satisfaction in saving lives to perhaps balance the lives he had seen lost. Martinez returned to El Paso and raised a family, maintaining contact with his former team members, organizing reunions where they could gather and remember and support each other through the challenges that came with aging and the delayed effects of trauma that modern psychology calls post-traumatic stress disorder, but which previous generations simply called the cost of war. The night the North Vietnamese taunted the reconnaissance patrol remains a case study taught at military schools where officers and senior enlisted personnel study small unit tactics and leadership under pressure. The specific details have been analyzed from multiple perspectives, the decision points identified and discussed, the alternatives evaluated with the benefit of hindsight that participants in the actual event did not have the luxury of possessing. Students debate whether Delaney's plan was brilliant or reckless, whether he took necessary calculated risks or unnecessary chances with his team's lives, whether the successful outcome validates his decisions, or whether he was simply fortunate that factors beyond his control happened to align favorably. These debates miss the essential point that combat leadership often requires making decisions with incomplete information under time pressure, that the luxury of careful analysis and consultation is not available when enemy forces are actively trying to kill you, that the difference between a brilliant tactical maneuver and a catastrophic mistake can be a matter of inches or seconds, or the random distribution of enemy soldiers along a streambed in darkness. What the case study ultimately demonstrates is not a formula for success that can be reliably duplicated, but rather a set of principles that increase the probability of survival, the importance of knowing your enemy, understanding terrain, maintaining unit discipline, adapting to circumstances, and never accepting defeat as inevitable even when the situation appears hopeless. Decades later, when the surviving members of that reconnaissance patrol gather, usually on or near March 17th, to mark the anniversary, their conversations rarely focus on the tactics or the combat or the fear. Instead, they talk about the bonds that were forged during those hours in the jungle, about the absolute trust that existed between them, about the knowledge that each man would do anything necessary to protect the others, about how that level of connection has been impossible to replicate in civilian life, where the stakes are lower and relationships are more casual and superficial. They remember fallen comrades from other patrols, other missions, other nights that did not end as fortunately as March 17, 1968, and they carry forward the stories and the memories because that is what survivors do, what they owe to those who did not return. They acknowledge the scars, both physical and psychological, that came from their service, the nightmares that sometimes still come decades later, the hypervigilance that never entirely fades, the ways that Vietnam marked them permanently and separated them from people who have never experienced combat and can only imagine what it must have been like. But they also express a complex pride in having served, in having done their duty as they understood it at the time, in having protected each other and survived and maintained their integrity in circumstances that tested every limit of endurance and courage. Their story is not about heroes, a word they uniformly reject, but about ordinary young men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did what was necessary to survive and complete their mission, nothing more and nothing less than millions of other soldiers throughout history who faced similar tests and whose stories largely remain untold except in the memories of those who lived them. If you, like me, believe that these stories from Vietnam still have profound lessons to teach us about leadership, courage, tactical innovation, and the human cost of war, this channel is your home. Here we explore not just the famous battles and strategic decisions, but the small unit actions, the individual experiences, the tactical and technical details that reveal how wars are actually fought at the level where young soldiers face impossible choices and live with the consequences forever. I know how rare it is to find content that treats military history with the depth and respect it deserves, that neither glorifies nor condemns, but simply seeks to understand what happened and why it matters. That is why each week I bring you stories researched from after-action reports, veteran interviews, tactical analyses, and declassified documents, presented as accurately and completely as possible. If you want to continue this journey through military history, learning from the experiences of those who served in Vietnam and other conflicts, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Together, we can preserve these stories and honor the memory of those who lived through experiences that most of us can barely imagine, ensuring that their sacrifices and their lessons are not forgotten as the years pass and the number of living veterans continues to decline.